The morning sun cast long shadows across Nellis Air Force Base as Admiral Robert Hayes stepped out of his staff car, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete. At 58, Hayes carried himself with the rigid bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades in military service, his chest decorated with ribbons that told stories of conflicts across 3 continents. Today was supposed to be a routine inspection of the base's A-10 Thunderbolt squadron, but fate had other plans. As Hayes walked toward the hangar, he noticed an unusual sight. A man in janitor's coveralls was standing beneath one of the A-10s, not cleaning as one might expect, but studying the aircraft with an intensity that seemed oddly professional. The janitor appeared to be in his early 40s, with graying hair and hands that bore the calluses of honest work. What struck Hayes most was the way the man's eyes moved across the aircraft's systems with what looked like recognition. "Excuse me," Hayes called out, his voice carrying the authority of command. The janitor turned, and Hayes saw something unexpected in his eyes, not the deference he usually encountered, but a quiet confidence that seemed out of place for someone pushing a mop bucket. "Yes, sir," the janitor replied, straightening but not quite coming to attention. His name tag read Marcus Thompson. "You seem quite interested in our aircraft, Mr. Thompson," Hayes observed, walking closer. "Are you familiar with the A-10? Marcus hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "I know a little about them, sir. Used to work on similar systems, in another life." There was something in Thompson's tone that piqued Hayes' curiosity. In his years of command, he had developed an ear for the subtle ways people spoke about their past, especially when they were being deliberately vague. Another life? What kind of work was that? Maintenance, mostly. Electronics. Nothing too exciting. Marcus shifted the mop in his hands, but his gaze drifted back to the A-10's cockpit. Hayes studied the man more carefully. Despite his humble position, there was something about Thompson that didn't quite fit. His posture, the way he assessed the aircraft, even his choice of words suggested a familiarity with military culture that went beyond what a civilian janitor might possess. "Electronics maintenance," Hayes repeated thoughtfully. "Military?" "Yes, sir. Long time ago." Marcus's answer was clipped, and Hayes sensed there was much more to the story. Colonel James Mitchell, the squadron commander, approached from across the hangar. "Admiral, I see you've met Marcus. He's one of our best maintenance staff. Never seen anyone clean an aircraft as thoroughly as he does." "Is that so?" Hayes continued to study Thompson. "Tell me, Marcus, in your professional opinion, what's the most challenging aspect of maintaining these birds?" Marcus glanced between the Admiral and the Colonel, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Well, sir, the GAU-8 cannon system requires constant calibration, and the hydraulics for the control surfaces can be temperamental in desert conditions. The targeting systems also need regular updates to maintain accuracy." Hayes raised an eyebrow. That was far more technical knowledge than he would expect from a janitor, even one who claimed to have maintenance experience. "You seem to know quite a bit about combat systems for someone who cleaned electronics." "You pick things up over time, sir," Marcus replied, but his voice carried a weight that suggested those things came with significant experience. Colonel Mitchell looked puzzled. "Marcus, I had no idea you had such detailed knowledge of our aircraft systems. Your file just shows general maintenance experience." For a moment, something flickered across Marcus's face, a look that Hayes recognized. It was the same expression he had seen on the faces of countless veterans who carried burdens they couldn't or wouldn't share. The Admiral made a decision that would change both their lives. "Mr. Thompson," Hayes said, his voice taking on a more formal tone, "would you mind if I asked what you were doing before you came to work here?" Marcus straightened, and, for just an instant, his civilian demeanor slipped away entirely. "I was flying, sir." The hangar seemed to grow quieter around them. Even the distant sounds of aircraft engines and maintenance crews faded into the background as the weight of that simple statement settled over the group. "Flying what?" Hayes asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "A-10s, sir. Among other things." Marcus's voice was steady now, the pretense of being just a janitor beginning to crack. "I was Air Force for 22 years. Retired as a major." Colonel Mitchell's mouth dropped open.
Major? Marcus, why didn't you tell anyone? We could have found you a position that actually used your skills. Marcus looked down at his mop bucket, his expression becoming distant.
Sometimes a man needs to start over, Colonel.
Sometimes the skills you had before aren't the ones you want to use anymore. Hayes felt a familiar tightness in his chest.
He had seen this before, good officers who left the service carrying invisible wounds that made them want to disappear into anonymous civilian jobs. The military was full of stories about decorated veterans who ended up working in gas stations or warehouses, not because they lacked ability, but because they needed distance from their past.
What happened, Major Thompson? Hayes asked quietly, using the man's former rank deliberately.
Marcus was quiet for a long time, his eyes fixed on the aircraft above them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain.
Lost my wingman over Syria. Mechanical failure.
I watched him go down and couldn't do anything to help. After that, the joy went out of flying.
Figured it was time to do something else.
The hangar fell silent except for the distant hum of machinery.
Hayes understood now why Thompson had been content to clean the aircraft rather than fly them.
There were wounds that went deeper than flesh, injuries to the spirit that sometimes never fully healed. But something about the situation struck Hayes as profoundly wrong. Here was a trained combat pilot, a man who had dedicated his life to defending his country, reduced to mopping floors in the same hangars where he had once prepared for missions. It was a waste of talent, but, more than that, it seemed like a continuation of the punishment Thompson was inflicting on himself.
Major, Hayes said, his voice taking on the tone of command, when was the last time you flew?
3 years, sir.
Not since I separated from the service. Do you miss it?
Marcus looked up at the A-10 again, and, for the first time since Hayes had been watching him, genuine emotion crossed his face.
Every day, sir.
But, missing something and being able to do it are different things.
Hayes made a decision that, in hindsight, would seem either brilliant or incredibly reckless.
Perhaps it was the recognition of a fellow warrior's pain, or maybe it was simple curiosity about what kind of pilot Thompson had been.
Whatever the motivation, the Admiral's next words would set in motion events that no one in that hangar could have predicted.
Major Thompson, Hayes said, his voice carrying both authority and challenge, I'm going to make you an offer. We have a training flight scheduled for this afternoon.
Basic maneuvers, nothing complicated. If you're willing, I'd like you to take the stick.
Marcus stared at the Admiral as if he had spoken in a foreign language.
Sir, I'm not current on my certifications. I haven't been through a flight physical in years. I don't even have proper clearance to be in the cockpit.
Leave the paperwork to me, Hayes replied.
The question is whether you're willing to try.
Colonel Mitchell looked concerned. Admiral, with respect, we'd need to verify his flight status, run him through safety briefings, ensure his medical clearance.
Colonel, Hayes interrupted, Major Thompson just demonstrated more knowledge of A-10 systems than some of our junior pilots. I'm willing to bet his muscle memory is still intact.
He turned back to Marcus.
What do you say, Major? 1 flight.
Consider it a chance to see if you still have what it takes. Marcus stared at the aircraft for a long moment, and Hayes could almost see the internal battle playing out. Fear warring with desire, guilt fighting against the pull of what had once been his greatest passion.
Finally, he looked back at the Admiral. Why? Marcus asked simply. Why would you take this chance on me? Hayes considered the question carefully before answering. Because 3 years ago, you were one of us. Because talent like yours shouldn't be wasted cleaning floors, no matter what happened in the past. And because sometimes a man needs to face his demons in order to move forward. The weight of the challenge hung in the air between them. Marcus set down his mop bucket and straightened to his full height. For the first time since Hayes had encountered him, Thompson looked every inch the Air Force officer he had once been. When do we fly, Admiral? Hayes smiled, recognizing the spark of determination that had returned to Thompson's eyes. 1400 hours, Major. And, Major? You might want to find yourself a proper flight suit.
As Hayes walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just set something significant in motion. He had no way of knowing that in a few hours, he would witness something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about skill, dedication, and the true measure of a combat pilot. Colonel Mitchell caught up with him at the hangar entrance.
"Admiral, I hope you know what you're doing. If this goes wrong..."
"It won't go wrong, Colonel," Hayes replied with more confidence than he felt.
"Trust me on this one."
But, even as he said the words, Hayes wondered if he was making the right decision. Marcus Thompson was clearly carrying heavy emotional baggage, and putting him back in the cockpit might be opening wounds that had never properly healed. On the other hand, sometimes the only way to overcome fear was to face it head-on.
The afternoon would tell the tale.
For better or worse, Major Marcus Thompson was going flying again. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly across the Nevada desert as Marcus Thompson stood in front of the base quartermaster, holding a flight suit that felt both foreign and familiar in his hands. The fabric was crisp and new, nothing like the worn, comfortable suits he had lived in during his active duty years. Those suits had been broken in through countless missions, softened by sweat and fear and the particular kind of exhaustion that came from flying combat sorties in hostile territory. "Fits all right, Major?" asked Sergeant Williams, the quartermaster, who had been quickly briefed on the unusual situation. The young man's eyes held a mixture of curiosity and respect as he addressed Marcus by his former rank. "It'll do fine, Sergeant," Marcus replied, though his hands trembled slightly as he held the suit. The weight of it brought back memories he had spent 3 years trying to suppress. Images flashed through his mind unbidden, pre-flight briefings, the controlled chaos of combat operations, and, always, inevitably, the last radio transmission from his wingman's aircraft before it disappeared into a cloud of smoke and fire. Marcus forced himself to focus on the present. Admiral Hayes had given him a chance that he never thought he would have again. The least he could do was see it through, even if every instinct screamed at him to put the flight suit back on its hanger and return to the safety of his mop bucket. An hour later, Marcus found himself in the squadron briefing room, surrounded by active duty pilots who regarded him with barely concealed curiosity. Word had spread quickly through the base about the janitor who was actually a former A-10 pilot, and the room buzzed with whispered speculation. Admiral Hayes entered with Colonel Mitchell, and the room immediately came to attention.
"Gentlemen, at ease," Hayes commanded.
"Today we have a special guest joining our training flight. Major Marcus Thompson, formerly of the 354th Fighter Squadron, will be flying as my wingman for this afternoon's exercise." The pilots exchanged glances, and Marcus could read the questions in their eyes.
What was a former pilot doing working as a janitor? Why was the Admiral taking such an unusual risk? And, perhaps most importantly, could a man who hadn't flown in 3 years still handle one of the most demanding aircraft in the Air Force inventory? Captain Sarah Chen, one of the squadron's most experienced pilots, raised her hand.
"Sir, what's the nature of today's mission profile?"
"Basic flight maneuvers," Hayes replied.
"Formation flying, some tactical approaches, nothing too aggressive. The purpose is to evaluate Major Thompson's current capabilities and see if he might be interested in returning to active duty."
Marcus felt his stomach drop. Returning to active duty?
That hadn't been part of the conversation in the hangar. He had assumed this was just a one-time flight, a gesture of kindness from a superior officer who recognized a fellow veteran's pain. The possibility of actually resuming his military career had never entered his mind. "Admiral," Marcus said quietly, "I should clarify that I'm not looking to return to service."
"This is just..."
"Just what, Major?" Hayes interrupted, his eyes holding a challenge.
"Just a chance to remember what you're capable of? Just an opportunity to prove to yourself that your skills haven't disappeared? Or maybe just a way to honor your wingman's memory by showing that his sacrifice wasn't the end of your story?"
The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had never spoken to anyone about Lieutenant Dave Rodriguez, his wingman who had died over Syria. The official reports had been filed, the memorial service conducted, and the squadron had moved on as military units always did. But Marcus had never moved on. In his mind, he was still circling helplessly above the crash site, watching smoke rise from the desert below. "Dave was my responsibility," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper.
I was flight leader. I should have seen the mechanical problems before we launched. I should have. Should have done what, Major?
Hayes's voice was firm but not unkind.
Should have been able to predict a catastrophic hydraulic failure that even the maintenance crews missed during pre-flight inspection? Should have defied the laws of physics to reach his aircraft before it hit the ground?
The room had grown uncomfortably quiet. The other pilots seemed to sense they were witnessing something deeply personal, a confrontation between two men about events they couldn't fully understand.
You read my file, Marcus said, and it wasn't a question. I did. After our conversation this morning, I made some calls.
Your former commanding officer spoke very highly of you. Said you were one of the finest combat pilots he'd ever supervised. He also said you blamed yourself for something that was completely beyond your control. Marcus closed his eyes, remembering Colonel James Patterson, his old squadron commander. Patterson had tried to get him to talk to the base psychologist after Dave's death, had offered him extended leave, had done everything he could to help Marcus process the trauma. But Marcus had simply gone through the motions until his enlistment was up, then disappeared into civilian life. Maybe this isn't a good idea, Marcus said, standing up from his chair. I appreciate what you're trying to do, Admiral, but I'm not the pilot I used to be. I can't guarantee that I won't freeze up there, or make a mistake that puts you in danger.
Hayes studied him for a long moment, then made a decision that surprised everyone in the room.
Captain Chen, he said, turning to the female pilot, you're dismissed. I'll be flying solo with Major Thompson today.
Sir? Chen looked confused.
Regulations require that training flights with unqualified personnel include an instructor pilot. I'll take responsibility for that, Captain. Major Thompson and I need to have a conversation that's better conducted at 30,000 feet. 20 minutes later, Marcus found himself strapped into the cockpit of an A-10 Thunderbolt II for the first time in 3 years. The familiar smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid filled his nostrils, and his hands automatically moved to check the placement of controls and switches. Muscle memory kicked in despite the passage of time, and he was surprised by how natural it felt to be back in the pilot's seat. Warthog 1-1, radio check, Hayes's voice crackled through the headset from the aircraft parked beside him. Warthog 1-2, loud and clear, Marcus replied, the old call signs feeling strange but comfortable on his tongue.
Pre-flight checks complete?
Marcus ran through the checklist one more time, his eyes scanning the instrument panel with the systematic precision that had been drilled into him over thousands of flight hours.
Everything looked good. The A-10 was ready to fly.
1-2 ready for taxi, Marcus reported.
Roger, 1-2. Follow my lead.
The twin turbofan engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, and Marcus felt the aircraft come alive beneath him. The A-10 was not a graceful bird by any means, it was built for function over form, designed to deliver devastating firepower in close support of ground forces. But, to Marcus, the vibration of the engines and the weight of the controls felt like coming home. They taxied to the runway, and Marcus was amazed by how naturally the procedures came back to him. His hands moved across the controls without conscious thought, checking engine temperatures, testing flight control surfaces, running through the same routine he had performed hundreds of times before.
Tower, Warthog Flight of 2, request permission for takeoff, Hayes transmitted.
Warthog Flight, cleared for takeoff, runway 27. Wind calm, visibility unlimited.
Hayes advanced his throttles and began his takeoff roll.
Marcus waited the appropriate interval, then followed suit, pushing his throttles forward and feeling the familiar surge of acceleration as the A-10 gathered speed. At rotation speed, he pulled back on the stick and felt the aircraft lift off the runway, climbing into the crystal-clear Nevada sky. For the first few minutes, Marcus simply concentrated on maintaining formation with Hayes's aircraft. The Admiral flew with the smooth precision of an experienced aviator, making small adjustments to keep the two A-10s in perfect alignment. Marcus found his own flying coming back naturally, his hands and feet making the minute corrections necessary to hold position.
How are you feeling up there, 1-2? Hayes asked over the radio.
Good, sir.
Better than I expected, Marcus replied, and he was surprised to realize it was true.
The fear he had anticipated, the crushing anxiety that had kept him awake the night before, seemed to have evaporated once he was actually airborne.
Ready for some basic maneuvers?
Ready, sir. What followed was like a dance performed at 300 miles per hour. Hayes led them through a series of turns, climbs, and descents, gradually increasing the complexity of the maneuvers as Marcus demonstrated his continuing competence. They practiced formation changes, communication procedures, and basic tactical approaches that any A-10 pilot needed to master. Throughout it all, Marcus felt something awakening inside him that he thought had died with Dave Rodriguez. It was the pure joy of flight, the satisfaction of controlling a complex machine with precision and skill, the indescribable feeling of being exactly where he belonged.
1-2, let's try some low-level work, Hayes transmitted.
There's a practice range about 50 miles south where we can do some simulated attack runs.
Marcus hesitated for just a moment.
Low-level flying was where the real skill showed, where pilot and aircraft worked together to navigate terrain while maintaining combat effectiveness. It was also where the risks were highest, where a moment's inattention could mean disaster.
Copy, 1-1. Ready when you are.
They descended to 500 feet above the desert floor, the landscape blurring past at high speed. Marcus felt his concentration focus to a laser-sharp point as he matched Hayes' every movement, maintaining formation while monitoring altitude, airspeed, and terrain clearance. This was flying at its most demanding, requiring total integration of mind, body, and machine. As they screamed across the desert in perfect formation, Marcus realized something profound was happening. For 3 years, he had defined himself by his failure to save Dave Rodriguez. But, up here, flying an A-10 with the skill and precision that had made him one of the Air Force's best, he remembered who he really was. He was Major Marcus Thompson, combat pilot. And, maybe, just maybe, he was ready to be that man again. The radio crackled to life with an urgency that made both pilots instantly alert.
All aircraft, this is Nellis Base Emergency Control.
We have a code-red emergency in progress. Flight 847, commercial airliner with 247 souls on board, has declared an in-flight emergency.
Engine failure and hydraulic problems. They are requesting immediate emergency landing assistance.
Admiral Hayes immediately responded, his voice crisp and professional.
Emergency control, this is Warthog 1-1. We're airborne 20 minutes south of base. What's the nature of the assistance requested?
Warthog 1-1, Flight 847 is a Boeing 737 en route from Los Angeles to Denver. They've lost their primary hydraulic system and one engine. They're having difficulty controlling the aircraft and need visual confirmation of their external damage.
Can you provide visual assessment?
Marcus felt his heart rate spike, but not from fear. This was the kind of situation he had trained for throughout his career, though usually in a military context. Providing assistance to civilian aircraft wasn't common, but it fell within the scope of Air Force capabilities when lives were at stake. Emergency control, Warthog 1-2 requesting permission to assist, Marcus transmitted before he could second-guess himself. There was a brief pause, then Hayes' voice came over the radio.
1-2, you don't have current certification for civilian assistance operations.
Sir, with respect, that aircraft has nearly 250 people on board.
Regulations seem less important than lives right now.
Hayes was quiet for a moment, then made a decision that would prove crucial in the events to come. Emergency control, Warthog flight will assist. Please provide Flight 847's current position and heading. Warthog flight, Flight 847 is currently at 15,000 feet, heading 090, approximately 30 miles northwest of your position.
They're descending slowly and having difficulty maintaining level flight.
Marcus could see the commercial airliner before Hayes called it out, a white speck against the blue sky that was clearly struggling to maintain stable flight. As they approached, the severity of the situation became apparent. The Boeing 737's left engine was completely shut down, and they could see hydraulic fluid streaming from the aircraft's belly.
Flight 847, this is Air Force Warthog 1-1, Hayes transmitted on the emergency frequency. We're here to provide visual assessment of your aircraft. Please maintain your current heading while we inspect for external damage. Warthog 11, Flight 847. Thank God you're here. We've lost most of our hydraulic pressure and we're having trouble controlling the aircraft. The passengers are terrified, and we're not sure we can make it to a proper runway. Marcus maneuvered his A-10 to get a better view of the civilian aircraft's underside. What he saw made his blood run cold. Not only was hydraulic fluid streaming from multiple points, but the landing gear bay doors were partially open, suggesting that the gear deployment system had been damaged. 1-1, this is 1-2, Marcus transmitted on their tactical frequency. I'm seeing significant damage to the hydraulic systems, and it looks like their landing gear mechanism may be compromised. If they can't get their gear down properly, they're looking at a belly landing. Roger, 1-2. Flight 847, we can confirm extensive hydraulic damage. Your landing gear bay appears to be compromised. Are you able to deploy your gear manually? The pilot of the commercial aircraft, Captain Jennifer Walsh, responded with barely controlled tension in her voice. Negative, Warthog. We've tried the manual deployment, but we're only getting partial extension on the nose gear. The main gear won't budge. We're going to have to attempt a belly landing. Marcus felt his stomach clench. A belly landing with a damaged aircraft full of passengers was an extremely dangerous procedure, even under the best circumstances. With the 737's current control problems, it could easily turn into a disaster. Flight 847, what's your fuel status? Hayes asked. We've got about 40 minutes of fuel remaining. We're burning more than normal due to the engine loss and the drag from our damaged systems. 40 minutes. That was barely enough time to reach Nellis Air Force Base, let alone attempt multiple landing approaches if the first one failed. Marcus's mind raced through the possibilities, running calculations based on the aircraft's visible damage and known performance characteristics. Admiral, Marcus transmitted on their private channel, I don't think they're going to make it to Nellis. Not with the control problems they're having and that fuel situation. They need somewhere closer. Hayes was already thinking the same thing. Emergency control, this is Warthog 11. Are there any suitable emergency landing sites closer than Nellis? Warthog 11, negative. The nearest civilian airport with adequate emergency services is Nellis. There's an emergency strip about 15 miles south of your position, but it's short and has no emergency equipment. Marcus looked down at the desert landscape below them. The emergency strip emergency control mentioned was really just a backup runway used for training exercises. It was barely long enough for an A-10, let alone a damaged commercial airliner with no landing gear. That's when Marcus noticed something that made his pulse quicken. About 10 miles to the west, he could see the long, straight line of Interstate 15. The highway was relatively empty at this time of day, and there was a particularly straight section that ran for several miles without major curves or overpasses. 1-1, Marcus transmitted, what about Interstate 15? There's a straight section about 10 miles west that might work for an emergency landing. Hayes looked where Marcus was indicating, and Marcus could almost hear the gears turning in the Admiral's mind. Flight 847, this is Warthog 11. We're going to recommend an alternative landing site. There's a section of Interstate 15 that might be suitable for an emergency landing. It's closer than Nellis and would give you a better chance of a controlled approach. Captain Walsh's voice came back immediately. Warthog, we can't land a commercial airliner on a highway. That's insane. Ma'am, Marcus interjected, with respect, attempting a belly landing at Nellis with your current control problems and fuel situation is also extremely dangerous. The highway gives you more room for error and a better approach angle. There was silence on the radio for several long seconds. Marcus could imagine the debate taking place in the 737's cockpit between the pilot, co-pilot, and flight engineer. It was an impossible choice between two extremely dangerous options. Warthog flight, Captain Walsh finally replied, if we're going to attempt a highway landing, we'll need you to clear the traffic and guide us in. Our navigation systems are compromised, and we're having trouble maintaining visual reference. Roger, Flight 847. We'll coordinate with Highway Patrol to clear the roadway and provide escort for your approach.
Hayes immediately contacted Emergency Control to coordinate with Nevada Highway Patrol, while Marcus positioned himself to get a better view of the highway section they had identified. As he studied the terrain, he realized the approach would be extremely challenging. The 737 would have to thread the needle between power lines and overpasses, maintain precise altitude and airspeed control with damaged systems, and execute a perfect belly landing on asphalt that was never designed for aircraft operations. 1-2, Hayes transmitted, "I want you to know that what we're about to attempt is well outside normal procedures. If you're not comfortable with this, you can return to base now." Marcus thought about the 247 people aboard the struggling airliner, about Captain Walsh and her crew fighting to save their passengers, about the trust they were placing in two A-10 pilots to guide them safely to the ground. He thought about Dave Rodriguez, and how Dave would have responded to this situation. -1-1. "I'm staying with you. Those people need our help." Roger, 1-2. "Let's bring them home." As the two A-10s began coordinating the most unusual escort mission of their careers, Marcus felt something shift inside him. For 3 years, he had been haunted by his failure to save one man. Now he had a chance to help save 247 people. The irony wasn't lost on him, but he pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the task at hand. The next 30 minutes would test every skill he had ever learned as a pilot, and demand a level of precision that would determine whether nearly 250 people lived or died. As he watched the damaged airliner struggling through the sky ahead of him, Marcus Thompson prepared to face the greatest challenge of his flying career. The Nevada Highway Patrol worked with remarkable efficiency, closing Interstate 15 in both directions along the 8-mile stretch that Marcus and Admiral Hayes had identified as their emergency runway. From his vantage point at 5,000 feet, Marcus could see the flashing lights of police cars creating a clear corridor down the center of the highway, while emergency vehicles staged at both ends of the landing zone. "Flight 847, this is Warthog 1-2, Marcus transmitted, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. "Highway is now clear. We're going to guide you through a standard approach pattern, but you'll need to adjust for the highway's orientation and elevation changes." Captain Walsh's voice came back strained with concentration. "Roger, Warthog. We're having increasing difficulty with elevator control. The hydraulic situation is getting worse, not better." Marcus felt his chest tighten. The 737's elevator controls were critical for maintaining proper approach angle. Without full control authority, the landing would become exponentially more dangerous. He quickly calculated approach speeds and angles in his head, trying to find a solution to an increasingly impossible problem. 1-1, Marcus called to Admiral Hayes, "They're losing elevator authority. At their current descent rate and, with the highway's elevation profile, they're going to come in too steep. They'll hit hard and probably break up." Hayes had been thinking the same thing. The stretch of Interstate 15 they had chosen wasn't perfectly flat. It had a gradual downward slope that would increase the aircraft's descent rate during the final approach. Under normal circumstances, the pilot would compensate with elevator inputs to flatten the approach. Without proper elevator control, the 737 would hit the highway like a meteorite. "Flight 847, Hayes transmitted, we need to modify the approach. Instead of a standard pattern, we're going to bring you in from the east on a long, shallow approach. It'll give you more time to stabilize and reduce your need for elevator control." "Warthog, we don't have enough fuel for multiple approach attempts," Captain Walsh replied. "Whatever we do, we get one chance." Marcus looked at his fuel gauge and realized they were all running on borrowed time. The A-10s had enough fuel for another 20 minutes of flight, while the 737 was down to less than 15 minutes. If they were going to save the commercial airliner, it had to happen now. That's when Marcus made a decision that would later be debated in aviation circles for years to come. It was technically impossible, probably against regulations, and definitely the kind of thing that could end a career if it went wrong. But the alternative was watching 247 people die. 1-1, Marcus transmitted on their tactical frequency, "I have an idea, but you're not going to like it." "Talk to me, 1-2. What if I position myself directly in front of the 737 during final approach? Use my wake turbulence to help them maintain a proper glide path.
The disturbed air from my engines might give them some additional control authority.
Hayes was quiet for several seconds, and Marcus could imagine the Admiral running through the implications of what he was suggesting. Flying an A-10 directly in front of a damaged airliner was extraordinarily dangerous. If Marcus misjudged the distance or relative speeds, the two aircraft could collide, killing everyone aboard both planes. Even if the maneuver worked perfectly, the margin for error was essentially zero.
1-2, that's never been done before.
There's no procedure for it, no training protocol. You'd be flying blind. Sir, with respect, this whole situation is unprecedented.
Traditional procedures aren't going to save those people. Marcus could hear radio chatter in the background as emergency services continued coordinating the ground response.
Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue helicopters were converging on the highway landing site, preparing for the worst-case scenario. Time was running out, and someone had to make a decision.
Flight 847, Admiral Hayes finally transmitted, "We're going to attempt an unusual approach pattern. Major Thompson is going to position his aircraft to provide aerodynamic assistance during your final descent. It's going to require precise coordination between all three aircraft."
There was a long pause before Captain Walsh responded. "Warthog, I'm not familiar with that procedure."
"Ma'am," Marcus interjected, "neither am I."
"But, your aircraft is losing control authority, and we need to find a way to help you maintain a stable approach. My A-10's wake turbulence might provide the additional airflow you need to maintain control." Another pause, then, "Warthog flight, we're putting our lives in your hands.
We'll follow your lead."
The next 10 minutes were the most intense of Marcus Thompson's life. He positioned his A-10 approximately 200 feet ahead of the struggling 737, matching its airspeed and descent rate while maintaining perfect formation. Behind him, the commercial airliner fought to stay stable as its pilots battled increasingly unresponsive controls. "Flight 847, reduce power slightly and let gravity do more of."